all the locomotor, I think the early locomotor, then the locomotor skills with the observation plans, the ballistic skills, the manipulative skills. Check the syllabus. We're exactly on task with the syllabus, so that will let you know for sure. Okay. All right, so we're going to look at catching today. So manipulative skills are often end up being what we call interception or reception skills. So receiving a ball in soccer would also be a manipulative skill, probably not a fundamental skill. That's quite a tricky skill, right? But it's still a reception skill. So some of the biomechanics and the perception ideas are the same for that reception skill. Also, we have things like lacrosse, okay, where they have to catch the ball in the net on the stick, right? Again, not a fundamental skill, but a reception skill. So these are skills where the individual is taking control of an object that's been projected towards them. All right, so this is a lot harder than our ballistic skills, where we've got control of the object and we project the object. All right, so typically you would see children able to do a version of throwing much earlier than they have any success at all with catching. Okay, catching's the most common skill, certainly in the sports arena. It's also the one we have the most research about, although we don't have the level of research that we had in the throwing section. Right? We've got a lot of research on throwing, not so much catching. So if you think about it, often, not always, we want to be able to catch with our hands, all right? And that's going to be either the out, depending on the game that you're in, or you're going to need to catch it and then pass it on and be ready to throw it. So we've got a lot of this, you know, the hand actions that we were looking at, and that idea of the shape of the hand that we were looking at last week becomes very important when we look at catching, all right? So when we look at young children and catching, often if they catch the ball, it's less about them really catching and more about the person doing a very accurate throw right into their arms or their hands, okay? So it's a little bit tricky to assess catching. I think it's one of the harder skills to assess. If you look at the MSU chart, certainly stage 1 and stage 3, if you're not paying very close attention, look extremely similar to each other. So it is, I think, one of, if not the hardest skill to assess. So let's have a little look at the characteristics. So in early catching, remember that we often see them just standing there with their arms out, right? They may not even be watching the ball hits their arms and bounces out. They don't have that idea of force absorption that we talked about in chapter 3. You know, if something's coming in, then I need to give, the more time I have, the more chance I've got of hanging on to the ball. So we see that not happening in stage 1, and then stage 2 is that hug. So if they time the hug at the right time, they might catch the ball in their arms against their chest. Stage 3 on the MSU is a scoop into their chest. So again, it's not really using their hands, it's using their arms and their chest to track the ball. So still not really efficient force absorption motor patterns. Often when you watch, not just children actually, anyone who's inexperienced at catching, one of the behaviors you often see is that they close their eyes or they turn their head away, okay? And that happens because there's so much visual information coming in, the brain doesn't have enough experience to manage it, and so it just shuts down, right? So you'll see that, as I said, you see it a lot in children, but in my experience, particularly for myself, because I'm even worse at catching than I am at throwing. You know, I was a gymnast and a dancer. I didn't do anything really with balls until I was a lot older. So I find myself doing the same thing, like I'll move my head back to give myself, I guess, longer to watch the ball. I'm not quite sure. It's not a conscious reaction. So I think it's more when you read children, try to replace children with inexperienced people, right? Because you're going to see it with older people as well. So more proficient catching, now we're going to use the hands, and the hands are going to give. And one of the important things about catching is that grasp action, right? It's not just putting my hands in the right place and the ball being there. I have to close my hand at the right time to stop the ball, right? So I could have my hands there and the ball can come in, and if I mistime the grasp, I've missed the ball, right? The more experience we get, the more confident we get, the more movement you'll start to see, right? So a really good catcher can run forwards or run backwards or run left or right to catch a ball. The brain also gets to the point where it understands, like, where do the hands, which way round do the hands need to be to catch the ball. There's no point in my hands being here and my fingers pointing upwards if the ball is coming in low, right? I need to be down here. So there's a lot going on with setting up where you are in space and where your hands are in space for this skill. That's why it's so complicated for the brain to learn to catch well, right? It needs lots and lots and lots of practice. Okay. So, on page 137, you have the developmental sequence for two-handed catching. We can always catch with, well, I can't, but someone who's good at catching can catch with one hand, right? Now, this developmental sequence and the observation plan are suggested, right? They're not validated sequences, but when I watch the children on the playground, to me they seem appropriate, I think is the right word. So the researchers that came up with this set of developmental sequences chose 3 components, okay? So remember, in running we only have 2, in throwing we have 5, in catching they came up with 3. They have arm action, hand action, and body action. And then they look at how does each component develop So like a mini MSU for a component. Okay, we talked about this with the earlier chapters. All right, but it's important that you get this because you're going to do an observation plan. Right? So this is an important idea for you to understand well. So then they're going to take those developmental sequences and turn them into a dual answer question. So often that's a yes-no question. Sometimes it's not a yes-no, particularly when you look at the arm action here, but there's only two options, right? That's what you want. You want to be able to use it, and you've only got to pick that or that. What did I see? Did I see this or did I see this? And then you can circle that step, all right? So here we have arm action. Do the arms move to adapt to the ball arrival? No. Means step one, right? There's little preparation, they're not getting ready. Yes means, okay, now I need another question because that doesn't tell me the whole picture of what the arms are doing, right? Is the ball trapped against the chest or caught in the hands, all right? And this one is quite interesting because if you catch it in your hands, then they say that's step 4. Step 2 and 3 come under, if I trap it with my arms, am I trapping it by hugging it or am I trapping it by scooping it? All right? So the observation plan for the arm action for catching is a little different to the way we've looked at on the locomotor skills and manipulative skills, okay? So you just got to think about what is it I'm trying to find out, what's the question I need to answer, and what level does that take me to, right? Then we've got hand action and body action, right? Do they move? Do they not move? Okay, right? And this is just for ease. If you look at the developmental sequence, it would be difficult to have that in front of you, watch someone do the skill, and decide which level they were at, right? Turning the developmental sequence into the observation plan makes it a usable assessment tool, right? This is much more straightforward to use. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah? Okay. So, we've got a lot more variety in catching, right? Task and environmental constraints really affect the difficulty of catching. You know, where is the ball going to be? Which shape does my hand need to be, right? So you might not consciously ask that question, but your brain has to decide that. Am I catching a football or a rugby ball? Am I catching a beach ball? Am I catching a tennis ball? What am I catching? Am I catching a frisbee? Because my hand shape, right, has to be different for all of those objects if I'm going to catch it successfully. Okay? Then the brain has to work out how hard is the object that I'm going to catch. Is it coming softly? Is it coming really fast? How much force do I need to be able to absorb if I put my hands in the way? Right? So, as I said, it's from a learning perspective. Now, throwing is more complicated from a biomechanical perspective. There's a lot going on in throwing, right? But from a learning perspective, catching is hugely complicated, right? Okay, so if we're going to assess catching, we have talked about this on other skills. The rule stays the same, but it's even more important when we come to catching. If I'm going to run a pre-assessment on a group, and then I am going to run an intervention, so a lesson plan or a summer camp module, right? Then when I post-assess, it's very important that I use the same task and environmental constraints that I used on the pre-assessment. So that means the size of the object, the type of object, the distance of the catch, the trajectory, which is often difficult, right? I find that tricky. Young children cannot track an arc. We'll talk more about that in another chapter, but they can't track like a rainbow. They can only track flat. So if you're tossing a ball to a young child, you have to be good enough at tossing to make sure that that ball flies pretty flat and doesn't go up in the air and come down. So I try not to be that person because my tossing is not good, my throwing is not good, I'm not consistent enough, right? So then I have a choice in my assessment. What is it I need to know about this person's catching, right? So I can use a product measure. So how many catches do they make in a set, right? Well, that might be useful if I'm trying to pick the best person to put in the outfield in a game. But what does that tell me about their catching, right? So we also want to think about using a process measure like the developmental sequence or the MSU chart or the TGMD, so that I understand what they are actually doing and I can help them get better. All right? So when do I need a product measure? When do I need a process measure? For me, personally, the product is irrelevant, but I'm not a coach, right? So it doesn't matter to me whether they catch the ball or drop the ball. I'm interested in watching, were they able to follow the ball? Did they even begin to get their hands in the right place, right? It makes no odds to me whether they drop it or catch it, but I'm not playing a game. Okay, so I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. I'm saying you have to pick the right kind for the data that you're looking for. Right? Oh, what happened to catching in older adults? Okay, apparently I deleted catching in older adults. All right, let me talk you through catching in older adults quickly. There's not very much research available in catching. With adults, it's, especially with older adults, not typically a skill that you see them doing very often. So they'll play tennis, or they'll swim, or they'll play golf, right? So they do a lot of ballistic type life sports, but they don't do a lot of these kind of reception ones. It's thought that if you're pretty experienced at catching as a child, teenager, younger adult, that probably is relatively stable. and that the most influence on catching in older adults is going to be constraints or factors that are affecting their movement speed or their ability to reach. So arthritis in their knee or their shoulder, right? Or some decrease in strength in their legs, so they slow down and they don't get to the right position in time, right? So they don't miss the catch, they're not in position to make the catch in the first place, right? There is some very little research that indicates that older adults can improve catching if you give them practice at that particular skill. So yeah, very little. And one of the things you want to be somewhat cautious about if you're looking at the research. So in this chapter, if you're a catcher, so if you're a softball player, cricket player, a baseball player, or you're the wing in the rugby game or whatever that position is in an American football game, then there's a ton of information in this chapter that you'll find interesting. Some of it I'm not going to cover because it's quite complicated. There's a lot of math and angles involved, but it's fascinating stuff. But be wary if you are looking at research, particularly if it's earlier than around 2000 or the early 2000s. A lot of that earlier research was done in a lab situation with weird lab toys, not real sport or applied scenarios. So the constraints in some of that earlier research might not be realistic to what we actually see out on the field. Okay? And I want to show you, while you're considering this slide, let me show you this because I don't know how much experience you have with cricket, but this is pretty amazing stuff. As is baseball, it's just I grew up with cricket, so that's my skill of choice. Okay, let's see. Let's try this one. This looks updated.
Now that we've helped people customize and save
We
them,
don't want
we
adverts.
can finally do some meat for you.
I miss cricket. Spend a lot of time watching cricket. bounced out of his hand and he really caught it. Oh wow, that was like inside out. And you know what, those cricket balls are bleeding hard, that has to sting. On edge. Oh, he's spitting about that. Stop that, you can find some more for yourself. Ha! Pretty amazing. Not that I'm biased or anything. I haven't watched a lot of baseball, in fairness, but I do love watching cricket. And what's nice about cricket at home is that all the little villages out in the countryside have their own cricket team. The cricket field is always right by the pub. And so on a Sunday, you drive out, you go get a pint, and you go and sit in the grass and you watch all these people from the village playing cricket, you know. And it gets quite competitive, but it's something that not just elite athletes do. Right? And it's something that older, in my era, guys, you didn't get girls playing cricket, although you do get girls playing cricket now. So, yeah. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that little cultural snippet there. Because unless you're from India, Pakistan, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, or England, you probably won't have seen cricket very much. So, all right, so we want to think about what makes catching tasks more difficult for some of them than others. Like I would think frisbee would be difficult because the shape of a frisbee is completely different. And we'll look at some other constraints in just a minute that you might not think about when you're thinking of catching. So catching is this idea of reaching and grasping, right? But it's also the ability to anticipate where the ball is going to be. So for a lot of interception tasks, same with tennis, right? My tennis strokes are quite good. My anticipation of where the ball is going to be as it comes across the net, like I move too late because I don't have enough experience when I was younger to tell when they hit the ball, where is it going to go? Where do I need to move to be in the right place? I wait too long, and by the time I go, oh, I know where the ball's going to be, I can't get there, right? So this idea of anticipation isn't just with manipulative tasks, it can also be with moving, striking tasks and things, all right? And the research on young children indicates that the ability to manipulate the object could be fully developed before the ability to be in the right place. So that means that if you're teaching catching, right, that when they can catch the ball consistently standing still, doesn't mean that they're going to be able to catch the ball consistently within a game scenario where they have to anticipate where to be, right? So that anticipation lags behind the manipulative part of the skill. Okay? So a lot of those earlier studies that I talked about before 2000 involved what they call coincidence anticipation tasks within a lab. So you would have to anticipate the movement to be in the right place with a moving object, right? So they often do that on a screen or on a board with filming, which gives us useful information about how the brain learns the skill, but it doesn't give me useful information about what happens out in the field, right? Because it's different, right? Doing it in a controlled lab environment isn't the same as being out in a game. So we want to think about what are some of the constraints, going back to our triangle, right? Use our triangle to help us understand what we see and how we can help, right? So some of the influential factors that we have, some of these influential constraints. Response complexity, so that's a task constraint, right? And what we see is that the more complex the task is, the less success an individual will have, right? Distance is another task one. How far do I have to move to intercept the object? So again, the longer the distance, the less successful we see if we were doing particularly if we're doing a product measure, right? Size of the ball. So now size of the ball is an interesting one because the larger the ball, the more successful an individual will be. The smaller the ball, the less successful. However, the interesting thing to consider here is that the bigger the ball is, the less likely I am to see a mature, competent motor pattern, right? So think about a beach ball. I'm not going to try and catch a beach ball with my hands. I'm going to try and catch it with my arms. Even one of those soft kind of slow-mo balls, right? They're about this size, and they're squishy and soft, and you can get them in all kinds of great colors, right? Initially with those balls, you don't see a lot of hand action, although because they're squishy, practicing with those, you can get hand action with them, right? The smaller the ball, the more likely we're going to see them go with their hands towards the ball, which is ultimately the most competent pattern to transfer into a game, right? There aren't really games, competitive games, that use a beach ball, right? I mean, we play on the beach, but who cares whether we drop the ball or it goes in the water, or, right? So we have to think about that. Object trajectory. So I said already, for younger children, they need that relatively flat. But if you look at older individuals, what we see is the higher the trajectory, the less successful they are, but it doesn't have to be, like flat isn't necessary for someone who's older. So what happens with a big archy ball, right, like some of those cricket catches we saw, the brain has to compute a change in location in both the horizontal and the vertical components, which again makes it trickier. Right? Okay, so object color. So there's some research looking at object color would be task, but background color would be environment, right? And there's been some research looking at the combination of those two. So again, with young children like 6, 7, 8 years old, elementary age, a blue ball against a white background is going to be more successful in a catch, right? Because the edges of the object, which we'll talk about, there's lots to come that helps out with this information in this chapter. The edges of the ball are much starker against a white background. So that might mean if I'm doing this in my gym and my gym doesn't have white walls, right, then can I get permission to paint them white? Or can I hang up big sheets of white paper on the wall to help the kids learning to catch? Okay. Now the older they get, the less important the ball color is. The other thing you'll often see is a gender preference for ball color. So if you've got a real girly girl who's been taught that girls do pink and purple, right, and you're throwing a green ball at her, then she may not be as successful with a green ball than she would with a pink ball, just because she's not paying as much attention to the green ball. It doesn't get her attention. She doesn't care about green, right? So that means that when you are spending your dollars buying equipment, it's important to think about not just a range of sizes, right? So we have that size ratio we talked about a couple of weeks ago, but also different colors, okay? Speed of the object, again another task constraint, right? If you change up the speed, you'll often see less success. So if I am throwing quite softly and then suddenly I throw a hard one, or I'm throwing hard and suddenly I throw a soft one, right? So changing up the speed, anything that isn't consistent adds complexity to the skill. Questions?
No, ma'am.
No? You okay, Kayla?
None.
Okay. It's cool stuff though, eh? It's very interesting. I guess particularly because I'm not very good at it. Okay, the next couple of slides have some grayed out stuff. As I said, this chapter gets a little bit complicated with the math. And I don't want to cover all of it and expect you to do that for an exam. If you're interested in catching as a skill, go back and have a look at some of this other information. It's quite incredible, but I'm going to try and pick out the pieces that I think are relevant for us at this level. So my personal view of catching tends to be very information processing biased. I guess because of my background when I was younger, and also it makes sense to me that the brain computes and does these math equations in its head. But when we're looking at it from an ecological perspective, we have this idea of perception action that we mentioned way back at the beginning of the semester, right? We have perception action and dynamical systems. So the perception action perspective comes really into play with catching. So one of the things that they think is occurring is that the brain learns what are called invariants, things that don't change. So stable patterns within a system, all right? That one's a bit complicated. The other one I think makes easier sense is this idea of an expanding optical array. So what that means is that as the ball comes closer to you, the optical array on your retina in the back of your eyes gets bigger, right? So as it gets closer, the angles on the retina and the shape on the retina change. And that information gives the brain data on how fast the ball is coming in, for example, or what shape the ball is, right? So it expands on the retina if it's coming towards me. It constricts on the retina if the object is moving away from me. And so what the ecological theorists would say is the brain doesn't have to compute where the ball is going to be. It can use these possibilities that are being provided by the environment. So it's like it's another idea of affordance, right? It doesn't have to compute. It can just use this information, this perceptual information, to be in the right place. So for example, with the optical array, the rate of change in the size of the object on the retina could provide information for my arrival spot to be in the right place to catch the ball. Okay. So I perceive the environment directly would be ecological. I compute where the ball is going to be would be more information processing. Ignore that second point. Actually, I should have ungraded the first point because it comes up again on the next slide. Again, there's a lot of math. But one of the things that, one of the ideas in the perception action approach is that perhaps the brain uses this perceptual information to keep the ball at a ratio of 0. They explain the mathematical description of ratio in the chapter. It's way over my head. I'm not that good at math. I was quite good at math, but not that good. So maths, physics, if you're good at maths and physics, there's a lot more detail here. But what you want to think about with this ratio of 0, if it is, I'm going to get this around the wrong way. If the ratio is larger than 0, the ball is going to land behind you. If the ratio is less than 0, the ball is going to fall short. Okay? And that's all you need to know about the ratio and zero, because the rest of it is, as I said, even I read it and I'm like, oof, I don't know that I'm following that. Right? I need to take that information to a math person and get them to explain it to me. Okay? So I'm not expecting you to know any more than that. And the only reason you need that is because when we look at the development of catching and how do children learn to be in the right place, that ratio comes back. Right? So, all right. So just the comparison here. If you're taking an information processing approach, right, then what information processing would say is that any errors you make provide heaps of sensory feedback to your brain and your central nervous system, and then the next attempt your brain will refine the calculations that it sets the motor pattern off with, right? So if you're too short, it'll make you move faster. If your hands weren't in the right place, it will change where your hands are. Okay? The perception-action approach would say that your brain subconsciously discovers these invariant relationships, the things that don't change. If the ratio is 0, I'm in the right place to catch the ball. Right? So, that's an interesting spelling mistake there. And this discovery idea has a lot of support in the pedagogical literature. So, if you're looking at PE teacher, and I know you are, Kayla, there's a lot of information about, do I use discovery learning in my PE class? And discovery learning is giving tons of experience, a little less feedback, and letting the brain discover what's successful and what isn't successful. It's a really interesting topic, way outside the realm of this class. Right? So it's possible then that children subconsciously learn some relationship, this ratio of 0 perhaps, when they stand still and they're catching a ball, and that then they're able to transfer that concept into being able to catch the ball when they're moving, right? It's always harder to catch something moving than standing still, just like when we did kicking. We keep the ball still. It's much harder once you add movement into the skill, right? That adds a depth of complexity that takes a lot more learning. Okay? So lots of experience. Parents, teachers, coaches can manipulate all these constraints, size, color, speed, during exploratory practice. Right? So, you know, can we help? What's an important piece of information that someone needs to know about this catch? So, for example, if you were watching carefully on that cricket video, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in baseball, there's a seam on the ball, right? So, people who are very experienced can gain information about what the ball is doing based upon their perception of the seam, right? Some of us can't even see the seam, and I've heard football players say the same thing, that they look at the laces on the ball, and that gives them an idea of how much spin or not there is on the ball. Right? So if I'm working with individuals who are more advanced at catching, then I could give them those kinds of cues to look for, right? But I wouldn't bother telling a beginner to look for the seam of the ball, because they're too busy trying to work out how do I move my feet, where do I have to be, right? So you have to judge the complexity of your feedback and your cueing based on who you're working with, okay? And as I said, often you're looking at people are using the word children, but bear in mind this would also apply to an inexperienced adult, okay? Oh, there's the older adult jumped up there. Okay, well we did that already, so we'll look at the final slide. So driving and piloting are considered manipulative skills, and they're interesting non-sport skills to consider, because particularly in this country, I think, in a way that would be very, very different if I was teaching this back at home in the UK. Because the capability to drive hugely impacts life in the States in many environments and areas of the country, right? If you live in the middle of Manhattan, you don't need a car to go and do your shopping. But if you don't live in a city, right, that has good transport systems, how do you get to go and get your shopping, right? If you live in Portales, I suppose you could use the PAC bus to take you to Walmart and then come and pick you up and take you home. But what a palaver, right? What would you do without a car in Portales? I mean, you can't go anywhere other than in the center of town, right? Now, I could walk to Walmart if all I was going to buy was a couple of bags of shopping, but if I'm going to Walmart to do my whole week's shop, I can't carry that home, right? I need a car. So, particularly in the States, driving has a lot of emotional emotion tied up with it, because it's linked with your independence, right? It's linked with my ability to take care of myself and not need someone else to come and pick me up and take me shopping, right? Or go do my shopping for me, okay? So, driving is a very complex manipulative skill, particularly if you have a manual gearbox, a stick shift, like I do. You know, so when we look at driving, so my landlady, she just passed away actually this summer, she was 100. So I've been here 15 years. So when I left Auburn, she was 85. And even for the next 7-8 years, she would drive from Alabama to Maryland on her own to have Thanksgiving with her friends, right? She was a nutcase. And she drove fast, like she was a speedster. She liked the speed. So there were times when I'm like, ooh, I don't know if I want to get in the car with you. Maybe I'll just meet you over there, you know, because it was like, ooh, okay. All right. So, you know, driving was really important to her. It made her independent. It allowed her to traverse this massive country that you have to go see friends. even my mum, when they finally took her driving license away, and she was only in her 70s, but her eyesight got so bad that they took her driving license away. I mean, her life completely changed once that happened, because she loved to drive, and she liked being able to just get in the car and go out for a drive. So once she lost that, even in the UK, where she could have got a bus to go anywhere she wanted, she didn't, because it wasn't her car, right? So we have to think about this, but also, how safe is it as we age to continue doing what is a complex manipulative skill, right? Now, again, in the States, you'll have been driving since you were 15, 16, if not earlier. And so all that experience at driving and manipulating has a role in maintaining your accuracy, your capability, right? The decisions that you make. But what kind of just keep thinking, constraints, constraints. What constraints are going to change as you get older that would make driving or piloting more challenging? Right? So give me a structural constraint that would make driving or piloting more challenging.
If we're discussing structural, could we say the quality of the roads?
That would be environmental.
Okay.
But that's a good, that's not an incorrect constraint to apply to the task of driving, but that would be an environmental constraint, not a structural constraint. So remember,
What about for somebody who is paralyzed from the waist down, but they now create tools that you could use if you can't use your legs, to where you can still drive a car and only use like a
stick or, yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
What about the seat like too up or too back? Would that affect like?
Yeah, okay, now you're looking at a relationship. The seat itself would be environmental.
Oh.
But think about the relationship of the seat to what is happening structurally with this individual, right? My legs don't get shorter, but they do get weaker, right? They do get stiffer. So if I don't alter where the seat is, forward, backwards, up or down, then my manipulation, this time with my feet, of the pedals could be impaired, right? So then we would have some functional constraints. So my attention span decreases as I get older. Well, that's difficult, because paying attention when you're driving a car is pretty damn important. So do I let a 90-year-old drive a car? Jeanette did. Did I approve? I'm not so certain. Right? If I had been her family, I'm not sure that I would have been happy with her driving at 90 years old. Right? My coordination decreases as I get older. Right? My ability to plan ahead decreases as I get older. And all of these things are hugely important to driving safely. Right? So it's difficult. What's the answer? I don't know. Do we introduce new driving tests for people who are older? That might be a way to do it, right? Once you're 70 or 75 or whatever arbitrary number we come up with, you have to have a driving test every 2 years to make sure that you're still safe to drive a car. But again, what do you do, particularly, you know, in this area of the country? If you live out on a ranch, 50 miles from town, and you're not allowed to drive, then what? Right? So it's
Normally, wouldn't you have somebody there, like, not necessarily if you live like out on your own in the middle of nowhere, but maybe a neighbor that lives, I guess, relatively close by that could drive you once a week into town to go buy groceries, or maybe somebody who could take you to a doctor's appointment, or you
Right.
just have to, I guess, like, plan further ahead of time.
you have to plan, and it seems so easy. I agree with you. Yes, absolutely. That's the only solution. But imagine how that makes the person feel if they're strongly independent, having to ask for help, right? So it's complicated. It's a complicated situation. But, as I said, particularly with driving, the years and years of practice and expertise somewhat balances the loss of structural and functional constraints that we see. The more they do it, the more practice they're getting, the more they can maintain the skill. So if I can keep them driving more regularly, up to a point, then that's going to help rather than only driving once a week. Okay. So, yeah, challenging times as we get older, when you don't live somewhere where there's lots of public transport. Questions, ideas, thoughts?
Not today.
Not today? Okay, so Thursday we will do a review similar in approach to how we did the review for exam number 1. Okay. Yeah, if that worked, was that review for exam number 1 useful?
Yes, it was.
Okay. So we'll do something along those lines again on Thursday. It may just be the 3 of us. I would hope that other people are going to watch today's class and come and join us on Thursday for the review, but I can't guarantee that that will happen. So we'll have to just wait and see. It may just be us 3. Okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Have a good day.
Dr. Wall?
Yes.
About England?
Yes, please.